Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear members of the Bavarian American Academy, dear colleagues, dear students, dear guests. And as this is the first BAA event for 2021, let me also, on behalf of the BAA board and our administrative staff, let me wish you a Happy New Year. Happy New Year to all of you. In the past year, 2020, we did not have many occasions to see and to talk to each other. And so far, we can only offer virtual tours of our wonderful newly renovated America House and of the new offices of the Bavarian American Academy. So hopefully this will change in the course of 2021. And we will be able to return to our plans and the schedule of events that in the past year we had to postpone in many instances. So the theme of our scheduled conference, Rethinking Solidarity, certainly appears to be as timely as ever. Let me now welcome you to tonight's virtual gathering of, on the heels of an event that has been much anticipated, the inauguration of the 46th President of the United States, which was conducted yesterday in Washington, D.C. Many of us certainly have witnessed the live coverage and have listened to the first words of President Joe Biden, an inauguration speech which in many instances was registered with relief and with hope and cautious optimism, specifically against the backdrop of the shocking events at the Capitol on January 6th, just 2 weeks ago. After the swearing-in ceremony, the new president went straight to work and signed the first executive orders of his presidency, announcing further measures he wants to put into place soon. Now, in order to shed light on the way forward of US politics, we are joined tonight by Professor Laura Viola, renowned political scientist and expert for all matters concerning American politics. Welcome to the BAA, Professor Viola, and thank you for accepting our invitation. We are very happy that you have found the time to be with us tonight. Professor Viola is known to many of us through her work and her media appearances, and it is an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce her as our guest. Laura Viola is a professor for North American foreign policy at the John F. Kennedy Institute at the Freie University Berlin, whose Department of Political Science she joined in 2011. According to her homepage, she is a native New Yorker who has become an adopted Berliner. New York is also where she started on her academic path. She has a BA from New York's Columbia University in political science and economics. For her graduate studies, she went on to Chicago, to the University of Chicago, where she earned her master's degree and her PhD in political science. She was a visiting scholar at many, many prestigious institutions, among them Stanford University, Oxford University. She was a fellow at the European University in Florence and at the LMU in Munich. So I should say, welcome back. You've been here before. Professor Viola's research interests center on international institutions and the global order, often with a specific focus on the US, its foreign policy, and its diplomacy. She is a principal investigator in the Cluster of Excellency contestations of the liberal script. Among her current projects is also one titled Trust and Transparency in an Age of Surveillance. It is funded by the German Research Foundation, and it examines the theoretical and empirical relationship between trust in government, government transparency, and security surveillance policies by means of a comprehensive comparative analysis, which puts the US next to Germany and Poland. And I think this is also a very, very, very timely subject. Now, her many publications, I can just single out a few of them here, include two monographs, and one of them actually was just published last year. It is titled The Closure of the International System, International Institutions and the Creation of Equality and Hierarchy. It came out with Cambridge University Press, and it offers a profound insight into the workings of international institutions, which appear to replicate exclusion alongside or even in the name of inclusion. This monograph has been reviewed widely, and let me just quote from one reviewer who calls it a particularly lucid account of the tragic and antagonistic nature of international history and society. Professor Viola has also published many book chapters and articles. I just want to highlight two of those here. So let me mention her article, Putting Path Dependency in Its Place, which was published in the Journal of Theoretical Politics together with Thomas Rixen. And it was awarded the Alexander L. George Award by the American Political Science Association in 2016. Her article, Legitimacy and Institutional Change in International Organizations, published in 2017 in the Review of International Studies, together with Tobias Lenz, is the journal's most cited article of the last 3 years. Our guest contributes to a wide range of national and international media outlets. She's frequently a guest in the radio and on television. For example, recently she attended Anne Will's talk show on the change of power in the White House. And so among all of these different obligations and tasks, I can only reiterate this, we are very grateful that you have found the time to be our guest at the Bavarian American Academy tonight, and that you will talk to us about your assessment of the United States post-election situation. Now, how are we going to do this? We will have Professor Viola give her talk, and then after the talk, we want to also talk to all of you in the audience. So all of our viewers and listeners are invited to use the email address that you will find in the chat, or use the chat to raise your questions and to comment, and Professor Viola will be happy to take your questions. I'm sure there will be many. Beyond tonight, the talk will be available on the YouTube channel of the America House if you want to revisit it or pass it on, share it with your colleagues, students, and so forth. Now, what are we going to see from this new administration in terms of foreign and domestic policies? What are some of the obstacles it will be facing? How will the specters, the demons of the last 4 years be put to rest? And how will all of this inform future transatlantic relations? Professor Viola will tell us. So welcome once again, Professor Viola, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul, for that wonderful introduction. You've set the task, the bar quite high. I'm not sure I'll be able to do all of those things tonight, but I'm certainly really pleased to have received this invitation and to be able to talk to you on the day after really a historic inauguration, historic event in Washington. I'm a little bit sad that I can't do it in person in Munich. I would very much like to visit the newly renovated America House, and I hope that we'll be able to do this soon in the future. I'm optimistic that we'll have another opportunity. So without further ado, I would like to talk about what way forward for America at home and abroad after what have been some difficult 4 years. Joe Biden's inauguration as the 46th president of the United States yesterday was billed as a new day for America, promising to bring an end to the turbulent tenure of President Trump, appealing in the spirit of Abraham Lincoln to the better angels of our nature. Biden called on all Americans to, quote, end this uncivil war. But even though Biden's inauguration has been cast as a moment of relief and of hope, a moment for leaving behind the chaos of the last years and reuniting the country, and even though we have learned from Trump that words and rhetoric do matter, still the legacy of Trump's years in the White House are the factors that brought him to power, and the consequences of his leadership will long be with us. In a very immediate sense, Biden's first weeks will likely be overshadowed by impeachment proceedings related to Trump's incitement of the storming of the US Capitol only 2 weeks ago. The storming of the Capitol marks the culmination of Trump's divisive presidency. But more profoundly, it is a reminder that Trump's election in 2016 was not an accident or a mistake. He put his fingers into real wounds and open sores that are still festering. The storming of the US Capitol was watched with disbelief and disgust by Americans and indeed by people around the world. One of the most common reactions by US journalists, commentators, and government officials, really from both parties, was to call the actions un-American and to describe them as something that only happens in the third world or banana republics. Now, at face value, these analogies to distant and foreign places were spontaneous, free associations meant to capture how remote, shocking, alien the pictures from the Capitol felt. Disbelief that it could happen here, to quote the 1935 dystopian political novel by Sinclair Lewis. But I want to suggest that if we look closer, analogies between the storming of the Capitol and so-called banana republics, or the third world, encapsulate a deeper contemporary anxiety over two persistent themes in American political history: American exceptionalism and American hegemony. When we look at how the Capitol riot has been discussed, what we are witnessing, I suggest, is the public realization of the fragility and precariousness of both of these things: American exceptionalism and American hegemony. America has thought of itself, in the historian Greg Grandin's words, as a place of endless becoming and ceaseless unfurling, but it has not escaped history. The contemporary moment is about confronting its limits, both domestically and abroad. This evening, I would like to make the following points. First, descriptions of the Capitol riots as un-American or analogous to instability in distant places are dangerous because they hide behind a notion of exceptionalism and avoid a true reckoning with America's social, economic, and political problems. They were not un-American, they were also American. Second, analogies between Washington, D.C. on January 6th and Kabul or Baghdad invoke sites of American hegemony and also the failure of American power to bring stability to those places. These references to America's forever wars underscore the perception that the US's hegemonic moment is slowly coming to an end. As Alexander Cooley and Daniel Nexon put it in a new book, the US is in the midst of an exit from hegemony and a rethinking of its global leadership role. Finally, Biden has promised to unify the country and restore global leadership, but these are no small tasks. I would like to spend the third part of my talk by thinking about, as my title suggests, what ways forward for American politics at home and abroad. As I already noted, the storming of the Capitol on January 6th in an attempt to stop the certification of Joe Biden as the winner of the presidential election was reported on in the US with disbelief and shock that this could be happening in America. Martha Raddatz, a veteran journalist at ABC News, reporting from the scene in Washington, said, "It is so horrible to know. We are in America where this is happening, on Capitol Hill. I'm not in Baghdad. I'm not in Kabul. I'm not in a dangerous situation overseas. We are here in America." Jake Tapper on CNN said, "This is not, Bogota." Former President George W. Bush on the day said, "This is how election results are disputed in a banana republic, not our democratic republic." Senator Marco Rubio tweeted, "This is third world style anti-American anarchy." And at a press conference on January 7th, Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat and Speaker of the House, said this event looked like it was out of a banana republic or some other kind of a third world. Joe Biden and Barack Obama also both repeated that the riots were un-American. These statements draw on deeply held notions of American exceptionalism, the idea that the US is morally superior and destined to be the vanguard of liberal democracy in the world. In America's self-understanding, the fragility of the rule of law, lawlessness, political violence are unimaginable in the true America. They belong instead to places ruled by chaos, violence, and corruption. Moreover, even though the analogies to the so-called third world or to banana republics were pointedly meant to condemn the mob and its overt white supremacist associations, these very analogies are themselves an expression of white supremacy. They evoke a civilizational discourse inherited from Europe, in which the world is divided into the civilized white West and the barbaric dark rest, not fully capable of self-rule and sovereignty. Comments about un-Americanism display dangerous denialism about America and American history. It is important to recognize that the riot in the Capitol was a product of American domestic politics, of past policy choices and institutional incentives, not an import from the Middle East or Latin America. It was not simply, as Biden suggested yesterday, that some Americans have hardened their hearts and now need to, in his words, open their souls. It was a display of emotional polarization and deep-seated mistrust of institutions that can be traced to electoral incentives, the ravages of economic inequality, and institutionalized racism that is America's historical legacy. America is politically divided. We can clearly see that in the results of the general election, where Biden won 51.4% of the vote and Trump 46.9%. We see it in the Congress, where both the Senate and the House are almost evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, with only a slight advantage to the Democrats. In fact, very slim majorities and a narrow partisan divide in Congress have become common in recent decades. We also see it in how Congress votes, with party members consistently voting along party lines. Vice President Mike Pence has had to cast the most tie-breaking votes in Senate history by a large margin. This kind of institutional gridlock has contributed to decrease in citizen trust in government, and low trust in government, in turn, makes it more difficult to solve common problems. If we understand the political positions as existing on an ideological spectrum from left to right, then polarization means that more and more politicians and also citizens locate themselves on the extremes, and fewer position themselves in the middle. Modern day polarization did not begin with Trump, but it is a phenomenon that can be traced back to the 1970s, when we see voting patterns in Congress increasingly split along party lines. As you can see in this slide, the way that the two parties position themselves on the ideological spectrum has continued to move to the extremes over time. We see something similar among the general public. Here we see among the general public, there's a very large difference between the political positionings in 1994 and 2017 to the detriment of the middle. And among the politically active, this is even more striking. One consequence of the hollowing out of the middle has been that candidates tend to be more extreme and less moderate, and voters are also sorting themselves to the left and right ends of the political spectrum. With fewer in the middle, party loyalty has increased and dominates over policy interests. Consider that while Donald Trump is leaving the White House with the lowest job approval of his presidency, 29% after last week's events, we can see that here in the top part of this chart, 60% of Republicans still approve of his job performance even after the Capitol attacks. And according to a poll conducted by the Pew Research Center, between January 8th and January 12th, 64% of Republicans still say that Trump legitimately won re-election. The Pew Research Center has conducted these polls only over the last week or so, and you can see the striking numbers here. Support for Trump has decreased among Republicans since the Capitol riots, but that decrease has gone from 70% to 60%. Right? Still really remarkable. Through a phenomenon that political scientists call affective polarization or negative partisanship, Republicans and Democrats have cultivated the other party and its members as the enemy. Negative partisanship emotionalizes party affiliation. You can see this here, that majorities have deeply negative views of the other party. They even think that the other party is a threat to the well-being of the country. And these party affiliations have become more important than policy preferences for many voters. On November 3rd, I called friends and family in the US, and what I heard from both Biden voters and Trump voters corresponds to these survey results really well. They both told me they were genuinely afraid of what the other side would do once in power. Fewer and fewer voters are willing to vote for a mix of Republican and Democratic candidates, so-called ticket splitters. Trump in particular has shown Republicans that this kind of negative emotionality can mobilize voters and win elections. Indeed, he managed to expand his base and win a historic number of votes in this election. There are good reasons to suspect that without the pandemic and the economic crisis that it triggered, that Trump would have been reelected. So it shouldn't be terribly surprising that Republican politicians, such as Senator Ted Cruz or Senator Josh Hawley, both with presidential ambitions, supported Trump's election lies, repeated them, and continue to support Trump and continue to do so even during the impeachment proceedings. There are simply institutional incentives to doing so. They see it as a winning strategy. The rioters at the Capitol have been denigrated, especially by Democrats, as lowlives. And we have heard again and again that the white mob was composed of disreputables, echoing Hillary Clinton's comment in 2016 about Trump voters being the deplorables. But the arrests and investigations so far have painted another picture. Trump's movement has mobilized the middle class, or at least parts of the middle class. There were doctors, lawyers, lawmakers, business people at the riots, people from the so-called respectable community. Trump has not simply radicalized a fringe group, although he has certainly done that as well. But a much larger part of the population has accepted his politics. The fact is that more than 74 million people voted for Trump. How to address the interests and views of these citizens is something that Democrats have not yet come to terms with. There are a number of issues at stake here, but two central ones are economic inequality and racial inequality, and are the result of our politics. Trump liked to emphasize how great the economy was under his leadership. In fact, Trump inherited a strong economy from President Obama, and the economy continued to do well until the corona crisis. During the Trump administration, unemployment continued to fall to record levels, and real median household income continued to grow. Under both presidents, income growth has been highest, of course, for the high-income households, but wages for low-skilled workers also rose under both. But the larger economic story is not nearly this positive, because the story of the last several decades has been really one of increasing inequality and the shrinking of the middle class. Household incomes have grown only modestly this century, and economic inequality on all measures continues to widen. Many Americans perceive themselves, perhaps even more importantly, as falling behind. Since the 1970s, the share of American adults who live in middle-income households has steadily decreased. Overall, from the 1970s to today, we see a steep fall in the share of aggregate income held by the middle class, from 62% to 43%, as you can see in this chart. While the share held by upper income households increased from 29% to 48%. Similarly, the wealth gap between the middle and upper classes is increasing even more rapidly. These trends reflect the growth in economic inequality in the decades since the 1970s and 80s as a result of policies of deindustrialization, financial deregulation, low-paying jobs, and debt, along with tax cuts. During the period of globalization, the cumulative gain in real income has been lowest for the middle income groups of rich countries, while the highest gains have gone to the richest, creating what Branko Milanovic calls a global plutocracy. As we saw in the Capitol riots, economic and political grievances interact with racialized politics in America. In a now famous study by Michael Norton and Samuel Summers titled, "Whites See Racism as a Zero-Sum Game That They Are Now Losing," a 2011 national survey conducted by the Harvard Business School showed that white people believe that discrimination against whites is now more common than discrimination against Blacks, and that the advantages of minority rights come at the expense of their own discrimination and their own privileges. They also believe that their material grievances are caused by this discrimination. This is a widely held opinion, even though the empirical evidence unequivocally shows that Black Americans are systematically disadvantaged politically, legally, and economically. American institutions have failed to guarantee equality as a social fact. And yet, for many white Americans, they perceive the gains made by African Americans to have come at their own expense. As minority and marginalized groups seek to improve their situation, seek redress for persistent historical and contemporary inequality, political and social blowback has accompanied these accomplishments. On the one hand, the divisiveness of identity politics is good news for equality. It testifies to some real successes in recognizing equal rights across a spectrum of diversities. They've unsettled others, and we see that in this political blowback. At the same time, of course, it harbors the danger of mobilizing groups that seek to subvert the legitimacy of rules and principles of equality. White identity politics in the United States has politically mobilized around the idea that whites are an endangered, discriminated against group who are losing because of the gains made by other groups. And the Republican Party has become a home for these grievances, and the party under Trump has stoked the belief that these grievances are caused by extending rights to minority groups. The party bears responsibility here. Although Biden has made an emotional appeal to our hearts and souls, it is American politics, the concrete choices and policies of the last decades that have gotten us here. As a number of thinkers from Martin Luther King Jr. to Greg Grandin have pointed out, America has historically been able to deflect attention away from its own domestic contradictions, in part because of its foreign policies and global leadership role. If we return for a moment to the commentary on the Capitol riots for a moment, it's striking that analogies were drawn specifically to Kabul, Afghanistan, and banana republics. And during preparations for the inauguration, the media repeatedly reported that the number of troops sent to Washington to secure the inauguration outnumbered those in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. These are, of course, places where the US has engaged in military intervention, war, and regime change in the name of spreading democracy and securing markets. Iraq and Afghanistan are part of America's so-called endless wars, begun at the start of the century. But the history is much longer. The very term banana republic refers to the unstable countries in Latin America where the US intervened militarily to secure the interests of large American companies like United Fruit and Dole. Repeated comparisons to these countries is both an acknowledgement of the US's global power and also an implicit acknowledgement of the failure of its policies in those countries. After all, it is US policies in the Middle East and Latin America that are in no small part responsible for the political and economic instability in those places. Trump's promise to make America great again and his America First slogan clearly tied domestic problems to foreign policy. They gave expression to real anxieties over the domestic costs of globalization, the loss of hegemonic status and power to shape the world to American interests, and fears of being mired in endless wars. Trump promised to reclaim American greatness by force of will, by being the tough guy, the hard bargainer, the strong man who will not allow America to be suckered. Ultimately, Trump pulled the US back from its global leadership role and weakened the so-called liberal international order that had been the backbone of US hegemony since the end of World War II. He has withdrawn the US from numerous multilateral institutions and agreements, the Paris Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, the INF Treaty, the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, the WHO, just to name a few. He has pursued a confrontational policy with China, including a trade war, and he has undermined the transatlantic relationship by, of course, calling the American commitment to NATO into question. But the unraveling of US global leadership, as Alexander Cooley and Daniel Nexon put it in their book, Exit from Hegemony, did not begin with Donald Trump. Since the post 9/11 period, American foreign policy can be understood as a struggle to come to terms with the US's changing role in the world. The challenge is how to adjust to the new multipolar order in which the US's leverage is still powerful, but declining, and in which domestic American support for extensive foreign commitments is weakening. With very different approaches, Obama and Trump both confronted the necessity of rethinking the US's traditional role as underwriter of international order. And Biden, too, will have to address this task. Biden has promised to reverse Trump's course. He has explicitly emphasized the need to return to diplomacy, to re-engage on multilateral cooperation, and to support and recommit to allies. Biden's nominee for Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has emphasized the need to return the US to a global leadership role. The administration plans to immediately rejoin those agreements that Trump left. And just yesterday, of course, among one of his first official acts as president, Biden issued an order to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Biden has signaled that he will put an unprecedented emphasis, in fact, on environmental policy and even make it a cornerstone of his foreign policy. But even though Biden's foreign policy will look and feel different from Trump's, it would be naive to think that with Trump out of office, the US's global leadership role, or the transatlantic relationship more specifically, will simply pick up where the Obama administration left off. First of all, because the international credibility and standing of the US has been diminished, this won't be immediately possible. But even more because the structural changes in the global distribution of power and the changes to domestic support for the US's global leadership role that Trump has been reacting to are still there and will continue to pose important constraints on US foreign policy. We are currently in the midst of what I would call a global power shift, in which a number of emerging countries are becoming critical to global cooperation while the US's relative power is in decline. One way among many to measure this or visualize this shift is by comparing the share of world GDP. Here we can see that the US and China have recently traded positions. Whereas the US economy for a long time represented the largest share of global GDP at around 20%, today China accounts for about 20%, while the US accounts for under 15%. And you see the way the trend lines are going. Another way to think of the global power shift is to consider that now an increasing number of states with a diverse set of interests are crucial to solving global problems collectively. The US is less and less able to set the terms of global policy on its own. Countries are no longer dependent as the US as they were during the Cold War, and the US does not have as much leverage as it did immediately after the end of the Cold War. And so it also has less bargaining power to force other countries to align with its interests. And this has become clear with respect to the leverage that a country such as China now has in trade negotiations, in climate agreements, and in security crises. Moreover, for many countries of the world, there are now viable alternatives to US leadership. China, and to a lesser extent Russia, have become suppliers of development aid, foreign investment, economic loans, trade agreements, and military security. Through a process that we can call counter-institutionalization, countries like China are creating new institutional alternatives to the traditional post-World War II international organizations. In these new institutions, such as the New Development Bank and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the recently signed Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, to name just a few, or to think of Germany's recent agreement with China, the US not only has no veto power, but the US is not even a member. These new institutions allow countries to escape the dominance of the US, and the US in turn is less able to exert its influence. What are the implications for US foreign policy? The global power shift means, first of all, that the rivalry with China will be the central strategic issue of US foreign policy going forward. In fact, Antony Blinken, in his Senate hearing on Tuesday, said that he believes China seeks to become the dominant world power and to undermine American interests. He continued to say, I also believe that President Trump was right in taking a tougher approach to China, adding, I disagree very much with the way he went about it in a number of areas, but the basic principle was the right one. And I think that's actually helpful to our foreign policy. We can add to this that the US-China rivalry, in turn, will likely shape the future of the transatlantic relationship as well. Biden is likely to continue to put European partners under great pressure to confront China together, especially with respect to competition over trade and global digital networks. A second consequence of the global power shift, I believe, is that the US will be less committed to international agreements that restrict its sovereignty. US presidents have generally understood that participation in multilateral institutions can be a powerful instrument of foreign policy. As long as the US has the power to set the terms or exempt itself when the constraints of those institutions become too costly, it's good to be in them. To put it differently, the US is most willing to support multilateral cooperation when its relative power is high, and it can itself set the terms of agreement. And it becomes more and more reluctant as its relative power and influence declines. In the past, America invested in multilateral institutions and global collective goods in exchange for allied deference to privileged American leadership. Consider that during the Cold War and the immediate post-Cold War period, the costs to using large-scale multilateralism, like the WTO, were relatively low for the US because of a broad alignment of interests between the US and countries in its sphere of influence and because of its outsized influence in those organizations. When goals and interests did diverge, the US was able to use its hard and soft power to push through its preferred outcomes anyway. This arrangement has become increasingly strained as other countries gain influence and leverage within multilateral institutions. And as the US's ability to dominate these institutions has declined, it has become more difficult to reach agreement and more costly for the US to reach its preferred outcomes. We see this clearly in the deadlock at the WTO and trade negotiations, and we see it in other large-scale multilateral organizations as well. Meanwhile, the United States has sought to shift responsibilities to other states while still trying to retain its privileges. As a result, not just since the Trump administration, but over really the last few decades, the US has abstained from or even sought to undermine a number of post-Cold War agreements and institutions. Trump obviously represents an extreme example of this, but it did not begin with him. Even Obama, who was rhetorically committed to multilateralism, failed to move US foreign policy in a decisively multilateral direction, emphasizing instead diplomacy in smaller groups of like-minded states. This is not to say that the US under Biden will reject multilateral cooperation. He's already declared it an important principle of his foreign policy. However, we should expect US skepticism of multilateralism to grow stronger rather than weaker in the future, no matter who is president, because the fact is that US leverage is decreasing. So I would expect even someone like Joe Biden, committed as he is to multilateralism in principle, will emphasize minilateral deals or bilateral deals and cooperation among the most like-minded of states, and not those that challenge the United States' position. In addition to the global power shift, America's foreign policy will be increasingly influenced by changing domestic support for global leadership. The long-held, at least on the elite level, American consensus on internationalism is cracking. Since the end of the Cold War, there has been a growing divergence in the preferences of contending domestic groups vis-a-vis the liberal order and the US's role in it. Trump really tapped into these cracks and recognized that even though Americans are still broadly in favor of American global leadership, they are tired of paying for America's military engagement, and they've grown skeptical of the benefits of globalization and multilateralism. Trump expressed these sentiments from the perspective of the ideological right, but in doing so, he broke the taboo of questioning internationalism and opened up space for the left to question America's commitments from a different ideological perspective. This will likely be one of his most important, if unintended, foreign policy legacies. A new generation of foreign policy thinkers on the left is questioning traditional liberal internationalism, much like Senator Bernie Sanders or Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have done on domestic politics. People like Obama's former advisor, Ben Rhodes, or Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss, and a number of public intellectuals are calling for something called a progressive foreign policy that sees a much less dominant role for the US on the global stage. It's an anti-militarist approach that calls for a reduction in defense spending and a withdrawal of US troops from abroad. It's less pro-trade, it's more pro-labor, it's critical of economic globalization, and is less committed to American primacy. Now, Biden himself belongs to a generation of centrists committed to the idea that the US leadership is necessary for world order, and for that reason that US primacy needs to be maintained. But if you look at the 2020 Democratic Party platform, it already reflects a move to the left on foreign policy. Not completely, but many of those ideas are already in there. And it speaks to the influence this new generation is likely to have in the coming years. Biden will be under pressure to review US commitments abroad, including to NATO. He will certainly continue to put pressure on European states to step up their defense spending. Some advisors have argued that US troop commitments to allies needs to be reviewed more generally. And he certainly will review US troop commitments around the world. Biden's also signaled a move toward the progressive left with his emphasis on climate diplomacy and also on a relatively new hesitancy towards free trade agreements. Like Trump, Biden will likely not pursue ambitious free trade agreements, but will look to revise agreements in a way that provides greater regulatory protections to workers and the environment. So even though they are motivated by different underlying beliefs, Trump's unorthodoxy on internationalism will continue in some ways to resonate through Biden's foreign policy. So I've outlined a number of problems or challenges that I see the US facing at home and abroad right now. What way forward? As Biden's inaugural address made clear, the most important and most difficult task of his presidency will be to, in his words, heal the country and restore American leadership. This is, of course, a Herculean task that has been made more rather than less difficult by the events of the last 2 weeks. And even though 4 years is a short mandate, I'd like to turn to consider how Biden might begin to work on these goals. The Biden team has said that the strategy will be to go fast and be bold. This makes sense, given, in Biden's words, the cascade of crises facing the nation, such as the health crisis and the economic crisis, the political crisis, the crisis of rights. Biden has already signed a number of executive orders, including on immigration, travel restrictions, and face masks. But other parts of his agenda will require congressional cooperation, including his most significant policy proposal so far, a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package and the tax and spending increases that this proposal entails. The road will not be easy, though, and Biden is facing a very narrow majority in Congress. It's also clear that Trump's policy views still retain support among many members of Congress. So Biden will have to try to overcome political polarization and gridlock. He has touted his record as a pragmatic rather than ideological politician who has been willing to work across the aisle. And certainly there is evidence that interpersonal relationships matter as part of the bedrock of Biden's policy, his politics. And building back opportunities for members of Congress to meet informally across party lines certainly could help. But as heartfelt and moving as Biden's pleas to come together are, they're not likely to be effective unless they are accompanied by institutional reforms that promote bipartisanship. First of all, he will need to tap into those areas where there is bipartisan support among voters. And if there's good news here at all, then it's that there are a number of issues on which voters from both parties tend to agree once the issue is removed from partisan framing. Tribal partisan identities and party competition divide Americans more than the substance of many policy issues. According to a recent study by researchers at Harvard's Kennedy School, there are a number of issues that enjoy bipartisan support among citizens, including on environmental protection, education, reducing health costs, and data privacy. And lawmakers, too, already share some interests that could be worked on, such as infrastructure investments, COVID relief, and the urgent issue of rescuing the endangered social trust funds, Social Security and Medicare. And for all of these things, there are at least some bipartisan plans in the works. Climate change is an instructive example here. And national panel studies show again and again that there is less disagreement between Republicans and Democrats, both politicians and ordinary citizens, on climate change, and that most Republicans actually believe climate change is real. And yet this has been such a divisive issue. As one study has shown, political polarization over climate policy reflects the fact that Democrats and Republicans disagree with each other more than they disagree with each other over climate policy. And this points really to the second thing that needs to be done to reduce polarization, because even there where there could be agreement in the middle, it's too difficult to get to as long as partisanship continues to get in the way. Political institutions then need to be reformed to reward compromise, reduce extremism, and incentivize the pursuit of general welfare over narrow partisan concerns. This means specifically reforming institutional rules of legislative process and changing electoral incentives to foster bipartisanship and remove the rewards to taking uncompromising positions. It also entails creating more deliberative spaces where ideas can be exchanged and tried out without the audience costs. These are not easy measures to put in place, but it would remind us that part of the problems that we're facing are not just about the character of individual Americans, but they're institutional and political problems that need those kinds of solutions. Even though Biden will be consumed with addressing domestic issues, there are also pressing foreign policy challenges ahead, as I've laid out. The biggest of these, as I've argued, is redefining America's role in the world. Even though it's an abstract challenge, it underlies a number of America's issues today. While all the attention has been on restoring American global leadership and re-engaging with global partners, especially from Biden's transition team rhetoric, a true restoration is certainly not possible. But Trump's radical departure from standard rhetoric has opened up space for a new domestic discussion on how the US should deploy its resources abroad. And this discussion has resonated not only on the right, but also on the left, as I've said, and in particular among a younger generation that was not forged in the Cold War environment and that looks more skeptically at the US's exercise of power. So this moment, I believe, presents an opportunity to deliberately reimagine the US's global role and to articulate a strategic vision to adapt to the structural changes already underway. Should the US throw its weight behind a reformed liberal institutional order that includes emerging players as equals? Should it retreat from its many global commitments and refocus its resources on domestic issues and only selectively engage international ones? Should it pursue a neo-mercantilist nationalism? Should it harness foreign policy to progressive social and economic goals? In setting a clear course, the Biden administration could be a bridge to a new era of US foreign policy and a new international order that lays out one of these options as a blueprint for its future foreign policy. Whichever path the US takes, it seems clear that both domestically and internationally, at home and abroad, the US is in a moment of transformation. And I suspect this period will last for some time, and in any case, outlast the Biden administration. But I don't think we need to subscribe to any notion of American exceptionalism to say that America has a dynamic and creative society. It has faced deep crises before and has, if not fully resolved them, then at least weathered them. In his aptly titled book, End of the Myth, Greg Grandin argues that America finds itself now at the end of its myth. Incantations of American exceptionalism and American hegemony will not be enough if we do not also reckon with the contradictions within those myths and with the actual decisions and politics that are consequential for citizens. Let me end with Grandin's quote of Canadian poet Anne Carson, who tells us, "To live past the end of your myth is a perilous thing." Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, very comprehensive and thought-provoking talk, and for sort of historicizing current events, for pointing to those longer developments, and for sort of opening up a few sort of avenues that we can think of being taken by the new administration. Thank you very much. So we have to just imagine a round of virtual applause coming through the air. And as I am awaiting questions from the chat, perhaps I can start with sort of a first question, a first response to your talk. I was also following the live coverage of the events at the Capitol that you described so well, and sort of the terminology and the comparisons. I was really struck also that at first there seemed to be kind of a lack of really a language with which to describe what was going on, you know. So they were probing, now, is this an insurrection? Is this a coup? What is it? And then it seemed kind of this fallback solution to say, okay, this is like, you know, Bogota, but we're not Bogota. You know, it seemed kind of a detour to really describe what seemed so unspeakable. And so, yeah, I saw this also as a kind of a way out of this utter sort of aphoretic moment that this could not be happening. And I would also agree with you that the demonization of those people who were then called very quickly were called the mob, and so on, that the very wording really echoed some of the phrases that we have heard also from the former president, when he talked about, you know, shithole countries, and he talked about in very despicable ways about other parts of the world. So I think there is something to be said about cautioning against these very unusual phrases that we've heard. Yeah. So we have a first question in the chat that asks about the polarization of American society. And can the polarization of the American society be overcome without strongly emphasizing American hegemony, or at least American supremacy? Not necessarily white supremacy, but does American supremacy and American hegemony need to be overemphasized in order to overcome polarization within American society?
Well, I guess maybe the thought behind this question is that something like a common foreign enemy has served to unify the country in the past. And we know that's true from history. We know that we have political theories that argue that there is a strong rally around the flag effect, and that foreign adventurism tends to bind the country together. And I think this is something that is also empirically evidenced during the George W. Bush administration. Of course, a really dramatic event like 9/11 that affected the territory of the United States is quite an unprecedented thing. But even committing troops abroad is something that tends to bring Americans together. But if we follow Greg Grandin's thought, then his idea would be the only way to really confront some of these problems that have domestic sources is to actually not allow the country to be distracted by these foreign adventurers, but rather to turn to figure out what are the underlying structural problems, the economic problems, for example, the political disenfranchisement problems that are stoking this kind of extremism. And the argument that he makes is it's not a coincidence that the reckoning, the trying to figure out what's happening domestically, is happening at a moment when American hegemony is declining. So in a sense, it could be that a strong hegemonic presence and foreign adventurism allows the United States to paper over its domestic contradictions. This is an argument that William Appleman Williams made already in the 1960s, a historian who argued that the tragedy of American diplomacy really is to constantly go abroad and to not face the contradictions at home. But the argument there, the underlying argument is that that may paper over these differences, but it's not going to lead to the kind of solutions that one would need to really overcome some of these problems. Okay, now overcome may be too much, but to really put in place some of the policies and also some of the institutional changes that can move the system out of a dysfunctional place where it is now, where, for example, Congress can hardly work. Because of the polarization among members of Congress and the two parties, and to actually move forward and create a politics and a policy that could be good for the country and its citizens. So, and in a political sense, yes, maybe a strong American hegemony can rally American citizens around the flag, but that isn't the kind of long-term solution that probably would do good for the health of the country.
Thank you. We have many questions in the chat. So I will just pick up maybe a couple and hand it over back to you. So we have a question regarding the negative partisanship that you've described in terms of this longer history since the 1970s. And the question goes to the role of the media, so the structure of the media ecosystem since the 1970s, and what role this has played in polarization. Can you speak to this? And then maybe let me just add a second question that relates to the role of institutions that you have also mentioned, and so what will be the relation to the WHO, for instance, that the new administration will establish, and are we perhaps doomed to repeat the last year every time a pandemic goes global? So this is a kind of a provocative question here, and yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for those really good questions. The role of the media is certainly something that is a very relevant topic here, and certainly something that many people are studying. And I think one of the questions is, how does this polarization really get started? Is it an elite level phenomenon that then gets carried over to everyday voters, to society, or is it something that the elite are picking up on and exploiting because it's happening in society? I don't think we've really unraveled the causal relationship there. But one thing we can tell is that also because we can measure it, we can see that what the polarization that begins in the 1970s is very, very clear in Congress and not as clear among in American society. And as certainly you see a number of trends that lead to polarization in American society that have to do with, for example, geographic sorting, right? Moving shifts between rural and urban environments that you see happening actually all over advanced industrial economies in Germany and Europe as well, for example, and that this kind of sorting leads the same kind of political divisions also in Europe. Because of the different institutional structures in Europe, they don't necessarily take the same expression in actual politics, but you see similar kinds of dynamics. So there are a number of possible explanations for how we get these polarizations at the elite level and at the societal level. And certainly one important aspect here is the media, and how the media, in particular, the deregulation of the media industry in the United States in the 1980s led to a fragmentation and the rise of new technologies, and also the commercial interests of providers has led to these niche outlets, the so-called echo chambers that we all listen to. So I think that there's definitely a big role for the media here in in particular also in the negative, the affective polarization side, because of the kinds of stories then that are allowed to be told to viewers without any kind of checks really, and that are also told in a way to keep viewers hooked, right? There is an emotionality that is built into the business model of the media industry. So I think the media has a very important role to play here, media fragmentation and also commercial interests that lead to certain kind of content. And on the question of institutions, I guess that was a question of global institutions. And so we know that Biden will rejoin, he has issued an order to rejoin the Paris Accord. He will do so with the WHO, or he won't leave it. And he will definitely seek out the US's membership in these multilateral organizations. Now, the truth is that many of these organizations haven't been doing so well, right? Even before. It's not just because the US left, right? Trump was frustrated with the WTO and also with the WHO because, this is part of his political approach, of course, but these organizations have also in many ways failed their mandates, or haven't been able to live up to them, or haven't been able to, have themselves been gridlocked in ways that have stymied them from carrying out the fulfillment of their duties or producing the kinds of common goods that was the impetus for having them to begin with. And I think that if you look at the WHO in particular, quite apart from Trump's reasons for leaving it, the WHO has been under critique for the way it handled the last several major disease outbreaks and also the pandemic. So I don't think that we're doomed to repeat history, not at all. I wouldn't have sort of a deterministic view. And I do think that these organizations can help. And I think that exactly in a pandemic is a time when you want to have a lot of international cooperation. We see that in the vaccine program, right? Both for really developing and also distributing the vaccine, it's helpful to have cooperation. But it's not enough to just rejoin the WHO, right? All these institutions too need to be reformed, and they need to be revived and revisited. And I don't know if Biden will have the support or even necessarily the interest to do that hard work.
Thank you. And for more on your Professor Viola's very sober look on institutions, I will refer you back to her book that just came out last year, where you offer a lot of analysis of how these institutions work. Now, maybe the next question would be regarding President Biden's reaction to the treaty that was just concluded between the European Union and China. What will he do about it? How will he react to this? It's quite a new situation. And then to something completely different. Another question goes to the role of civil society and in the transatlantic moment. What can civil society do to follow the call that Biden uttered for more unity in civil discourse in society, in public life?
Yeah, so I think that the example of the recent agreement between European countries and China is a good example of the kind of dynamic that I was talking about in the talk, right? It would be unimaginable in the 1990s or during the Cold War that the United States allies would reach an agreement with another important power without taking into consideration the views of the United States or without deferring to the views of the United States. We know already that Washington's not happy, right? And Germany knew that Washington would not be happy with this agreement. The goal of the United States is to try to get European countries on board with its confrontational policy towards China. And I think it's interesting that on the one hand, it was probably easier for European countries to not sign on to America's China policy as long as it was being conducted by Donald Trump. Right? It's sort of easier to say no to someone you don't like, right? To someone you think you have fundamental disagreements with anyway. I think they would find it much more difficult to do that with Biden, right? So the timing of the agreement is also interesting here. If Biden comes and says, look, partners, right, we want to work together again, you can't continue a policy towards China that's based on lucrative interests and that doesn't take into account the geopolitical aspects, I think Europe might have a more difficult time simply sort of ignoring that and not taking into account, or would have to certainly think twice about how to react to that. But so I think that, you know, there will be more conflicts on this issue going forward. But I also think that the very fact that we get this is speaks to the idea that the United States has lost a lot of its leverage in the world. Another example in a similar vein is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that I mentioned in my talk. Obama asked the European allies of the United States not to join. Obama explicitly said, do not join because this is not in our common strategic interest. And they did it anyway, right? So this sort of lack of the loosening of the United States leverage over its allies hasn't just happened since the Trump administration. It's been a long and ongoing process, and in some ways a natural reflection of the changing order in the international system, the changing balance of power. But it certainly means that there will be more conflict between the United States and European partners going forward on this very issue. And those confrontations, I think, will put Europe in particular in a very difficult position because it will be squeezed on the one hand between its economic interests vis-a-vis China and its economic and political interests vis-a-vis the United States. The second question about civil society, I think this is a wonderful question. It's something I didn't address at all, but I do think, and I really don't have any expertise on this, but I do think that one of the real strengths of American democracy and one of the reasons why the United States won't so easily succumb to efforts to sort of overthrow its institutions or to call into question the rules and principles that underpin American politics is because there is such a vibrant and active civil society. And you've seen that mobilized in the last 4 years. And I mean, even so, it was a tremendous effort. But I think that in places where you don't have such a vibrant civil society, you see that in many countries in Eastern Europe or many countries in Asia where there's not sort of a long history and also not the opportunities to have such a vibrant civil society. It's really much, much more difficult to resist some of these political forces. And so I think that civil society must be an important key here. And then the question about a transatlantic or a transnational civil society, I think, is also a very interesting one. And I don't know how strong that really is, but it would be a nice thing to have, wouldn't it? I mean, certainly transnational solidarity at the civil society level, I think, would be something that could be influential in the future.
Yeah, we could argue that even within the last 4 years, many things actually worked quite well, right? In the transatlantic cooperation, many programs sort of continued their work under the radar of big politics, and I think that speaks to what you've said. It's the importance of the things that you don't always focus on, that keep a certain discourse playing out. Yeah. With regard to President Biden's self-fashioning as a transitional president, that's what he said a couple of times, and it seemed also that his inauguration speech had this note of self-effacement almost, in contrast to many other politicians' self-fashionings that we've seen lately. So what kind of role does that play for what you have described as the beginning of a transformational phase also, perhaps in US politics? Does that play any role, that he is sort of also prepared to step back, that he also has said that he will only be around for one presidency, and that he wants to give room also to other actors on the political stage?
Yeah, so he's called himself a bridge, right? And we can think of it maybe in the sense of a caretaker government, not in the sense that he's sort of not a lame duck and not going to do anything, but that this is sort of an interim moment, before the presidency is handed off to, I think, another generation, really. I mean, I think one of the things that are going to change politics in America is certainly generational change. You see that in Congress. I mean, if you look at Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, also their top aides and supporters in Congress, they're in their 80s, right? Late 70s and 80s. They're really quite old for especially for American politicians. American politicians are typically younger as compared to, for example, European politicians, right? This is always something that was said in the Cold War. Compare the American presidents with the Soviet presidents, right? Or Soviet premiers. And this is, reflects on the one hand, of course, the general aging of American society, but on the other hand, also the inevitability of a generational change coming to American politics in the presidency and also in Congress in the next few years. I think also he's speaking in, this idea of transition. He's also clearly pointing to what you might call demographic change as well. So the generational change, but also, he's very decidedly selected Kamala Harris to be his vice president because she's a woman. He said that he wanted to choose a woman to be a vice president. And he also wanted, I think, to make a statement about the diversity of the country and have that diversity reflected in the highest levels of power. And I think this also is meant to reflect that the country itself is going through this kind of demographic change. So I think, the idea of a bridge presidency is a bridge to generational change and to demographic change. But another thing that I hinted at least in my talk, was I think that there is also a moment to set up a new direction in a number of issues, right? This is sort of a caesura, it's a break, the Trump presidency, and now Biden is sort of stabilizing the ship, right, of state, and he's has the opportunity to set it on a course, right, that might be taken up by others, but he certainly won't be able to, he won't work miracles. He'll only be able to sort of set out the blueprint. But if he can do that, and even that is a really big task, he may be able to set the United States on a path both domestically and internationally that carves out a new space for policy in the United States. That's something that I see as possible in the foreign policy domain that I know better from my research because of these things, because of his openness to these new ideas, and because these new ideas are being driven by this generational and demographic change, which the country is undergoing inevitably.
Okay, perhaps one final question that I will ask our guest. There is a question regarding the rhetoric of healing. Is there, and I'm just sort of paraphrasing the question here, is there any connection that you see between this the rhetoric of healing and issues that are sort of not soft power issues, but that have to do with the economy and economic growth and economic stability? So do you see any connection between the rhetoric of healing and what's going to happen in the American economy?
Well, it's interesting, inaugural addresses are very carefully scripted things usually, right? And there are many references to past speeches or past quotes or references to major American ideas or events. And I think that Biden has said the word healing many times, even in the lead up to the inauguration yesterday. But it certainly embodies, I think, for him, on the one hand, reference to the health crisis, right? That healing as very much something that we consider to be, let's say a medical issue, an issue of the body, right? So a reference to the pandemic. and the toll that it's taken the United States, something that he has made a point to acknowledge very explicitly over the last few days in a way that Trump didn't. And but he's also thinking about healing in another sense that we use that word, right? In the healing of the soul. He's made that reference also many times, a healing of wounds that have been created by the divisions, the political divisions of the country. Sort of my critique of his healing rhetoric in the remarks that I just made is that I think it would be, he definitely has the job of trying to identify with the country and put the country on the same page through his rhetoric, right? And to have an emotional speech so that the country does feel like this is a new beginning and that they can come together. And he, offered the olive branch, and those are things that he needed to do rhetorically. My question, though, is we cannot leave it at the rhetoric of healing, right? Of opening our souls, of unifying, because there are real political problems, there are real economic problems that underlie these issues. It's not just that we haven't been open to each other. It's not just that we've hardened our hearts to one another. And certainly he's aware of that, but I think the Democrats really need to address some of those underlying problems, and to understand that those underlying problems are part of the causes for where we are today. It's not just that the other side is unreasonable or not rational, right? It's that there are real economic inequalities. There are ways in which racial inequalities have been exploited in these countries, and they've been done so through politics, through institutions, through rules, and through real actions by agents, right? And maybe yesterday wasn't the moment to reflect on that level, right? But I think that's certainly the level that politics needs to get down to overcome some of the challenges that we're facing now.
Yeah, so healing may be a good metaphor to start with, but it needs to be followed by actual measures that overcome polarization, or even sort of keep people in support of the new president, right? Because also his own party seems to be not so homogenous. Yeah, so it's been such a pleasure listening to you and talking to you, even though I was just ventriloquizing the questions that people have put out on the chat. I think our time is running out. And so let me once again thank you for being with us, at least virtually. And I'm sure that we will have an opportunity to invite you back to Munich to see the America House in person once we see a little clearer where the pandemic will go and when it will subside. So again, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And I will say goodbye to you, Professor Viola, and I'll say goodbye to all of you who have joined us for the talk tonight. And take care. I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening.